December 1944. In the frozen Ardennes, German troops were certain the Americans in Bastogne would starve and surrender within days. But then the sky opened, and hundreds of American planes roared overhead, dropping a storm of supplies that turned despair into defiance. It was more than a resupply. It was a message. The United States could feed and arm an entire town, even under siege. December 23rd, 1944. 11:45 a.m., Senamps Hill, Belgium. The wind cut across the snow like a blade, sharp and merciless. A young German soldier of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division pressed frozen binoculars against his face, his hands trembling not from cold, but from something deeper: confusion, disbelief. For 6 days, his comrades had spoken confidently of Bastogne. The Americans are trapped. They'll starve, freeze, and surrender. It was said at every fire pit, whispered in every trench. The men believed it. Their commanders believed it. Even Hitler himself had promised it. But on this bitter morning, the sky itself betrayed that promise. At first, the German sentry thought he saw a trick of the light, tiny dark specks moving against the pale clouds. He rubbed his eyes, checked again. Then the sound reached him, a distant thunder that grew louder by the second. The horizon filled with an impossible sight, a formation so vast it seemed to stretch forever. C-47 transport planes. Not a dozen, not even 50, 241 of them. They're everywhere, the soldier whispered, lowering his field glasses. The sky over Belgium had become a river of steel wings, glinting in the weak winter sun. And then the parachutes appeared. Red, blue, yellow, white. They blossomed in the air like fireworks on New Year's Eve. Except each canopy carried life itself: ammunition, medical supplies, food, fuel, descending into Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was waiting. The German troops had been told the Americans were finished, that the siege was complete, that Bastogne was theirs. But as they stood in the snow, watching the blizzard of parachutes drift gently into the surrounded town, a different truth settled on them like the cold itself. This wasn't Dunkirk. This wasn't Stalingrad. This was something new, something terrifying. The Americans were not only holding out. They were being fed, armed, and strengthened in full view of their enemy. One German officer muttered bitterly, "Not even the Luftwaffe at its height could have done this." His words hung in the frozen air, heavier than the artillery shells that had opened the Ardennes offensive a week earlier. The battle was far from over, but for those German soldiers staring up at the white sky over Bastogne, December 23rd was the day doubt entered their hearts, the day they began to realize this war would not end the way they had been promised. Only a week before that white sky over Bastogne, the mood among German soldiers had been very different. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The silence of the Ardennes was shattered by a thunderclap of steel. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire in unison, unleashing a 90-minute barrage that shook the frozen earth from Monschau to Luxembourg. The ground quaked, trees splintered. American outposts simply vanished under a storm of shells. For the men of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, it felt like the beginning of victory. They had been told this was Germany's moment of destiny. Hitler himself had called the operation Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. His words were delivered to the troops with the weight of prophecy. The Americans are weak, decadent, soft. Their lines in the Ardennes are thin, held by exhausted divisions and green recruits. You will smash them, as we smashed the French in 1940. The soldiers believed him. Why wouldn't they? Just 4 years earlier, the Wehrmacht had conquered France in 6 weeks. Now, with one last great offensive, they were promised not only victory, but redemption. In the frostbitten forests of the Eifel, German units prepared for the assault. The narrow roads clogged with men, horses, and armor. Columns stretched for miles, headlights dimmed under blackout covers, boots crunching on ice. Veterans who had survived the blood and mud of the Eastern Front found themselves marching beside young Luftwaffe and naval recruits pressed into infantry service. Morale was high. They were promised new weapons, fresh supplies, and, most importantly, surprise. The Americans, they were told, would collapse at the first blow. And at first, the promise seemed real. When the attack began, American lines buckled. Entire units fled or surrendered. German tanks rolled through shattered defenses, and the roads west appeared wide open. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as if history might repeat itself, the Ardennes forest once again becoming the springboard for a German breakthrough, just as it had been in 1940. In the ranks of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, soldiers grinned through the cold, their breath fogging in the air. They laughed at stories of Americans abandoning positions, of cowards running, of supply dumps left behind in panic. Some even compared it to Dunkirk in reverse. The Allies, trapped and broken, waiting for the final blow. But beneath the bravado, there was a truth no one dared speak aloud. Germany had gambled everything on this offensive. Supplies were thin, fuel was scarce, and the army was held together more by hope than by strength. Still, in those first days, the illusion of victory was enough to carry them forward. The road to Antwerp, the prize Hitler had demanded, seemed within reach. And Bastogne, the small Belgian town at the center of 7 key roads, looked like just another stop along the way. The Germans were certain the Americans would crumble. They didn't know yet that the men waiting for them in Bastogne, the screaming eagles of the 101st Airborne, were about to change everything. December nights in the Ardennes were not kind. The forest was a place of black silence, broken only by the creak of frozen branches and the muffled crunch of boots on icy ground. On December 15th, the final troop movements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division began. Thousands of men pushed forward along narrow forest paths, some carrying rifles older than themselves, others dragging ammunition sleds behind weary horses. Frost bit their faces, and every exhale became a plume of white in the air, but their spirits were high. They had been promised much. The propaganda leaflets told them America was weak, her soldiers soft and unprepared for a real winter. Officers repeated the words of the Führer: "This is our destiny, the last great blow that will change everything." Young replacements, many pulled from the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, whispered about the new weapons they had been told to expect: miracle tanks, jet planes, V weapons that would crush any resistance. They marched believing those promises, clutching their rifles and humming patriotic songs to keep warm. Veterans knew better. Among the grenadiers were men who had bled on the Russian steppe, who had fought at Normandy and barely escaped with their lives. They recognized the truth in the clattering wagons, the shortage of fuel, the frostbitten hands clutching ersatz bread. Still, they kept silent. For now, hope was stronger than doubt. As the convoys wound through the frozen hills, a strange contrast appeared. The German soldiers chewed hard biscuits and ersatz coffee, food that barely kept them standing. Yet the rumor spread quickly. American soldiers they had overrun were leaving behind fires still burning in barrels, half-full tins of rations, even hot coffee in metal cups. The younger grenadiers laughed. "See, they are careless, weak, they waste everything." But the older ones frowned. To them, it was not weakness. It was a sign of something far more dangerous: abundance. By December 18th, the division pressed closer to Bastogne. The narrow forest roads clogged with tanks, half-tracks, and marching infantry. Horse-drawn carts carried supplies that should have been delivered by trucks. Fuel convoys struggled to keep pace. And then came the resistance. American rearguards, elements of the 10th Armored Division, suddenly appeared on the roads. They fought from behind roadblocks, destroyed bridges, and made the Germans pay for every mile. What was supposed to be a swift advance began to slow. Still, the men of the 26th pressed on. They told themselves Bastogne would fall quickly, that the Americans inside could not possibly stand against the might of the Wehrmacht. But in the back of many minds, the cracks were already forming. The promises of quick victory felt thinner with each frozen mile. Ahead lay Bastogne, the crossroads town that would either open the road to Antwerp or become the place where illusions began to die. By December 18th, 1944, the German advance had gathered momentum like an avalanche. Entire American regiments had been swept aside. Villages, once thought safe for rest and refit, were suddenly under fire. For a brief, dangerous moment, it seemed the Ardennes offensive might succeed. But at the heart of the German plan lay a single name: Bastogne. On a map, Bastogne was nothing more than a modest Belgian market town of 4,000 people, surrounded by rolling hills and winter fields. But on the battlefield, Bastogne was everything. 7 major roads converged on that one town. Whoever held Bastogne held the arteries of the Ardennes. For the Germans, seizing Bastogne was the key to Antwerp, the grand prize Hitler demanded. Without it, fuel and reinforcements could not flow freely to the front. Take Bastogne, and the road to the Meuse River and perhaps victory would open. For the Americans, Bastogne was lifeblood. Lose it, and the entire southern flank of the Ardennes might unravel. Reinforcements would be cut off, supply lines severed. The offensive could roll straight to the coast. Both sides understood this. General Hasse von Manteuffel, commanding the German 5th Panzer Army, gave explicit orders. Capture Bastogne, do not delay. His armored spearheads pushed west with urgency, tanks grinding over frozen ground, infantry struggling to keep pace. But the Americans were moving just as fast. From Reims, France, over 100 miles away, the 101st Airborne Division, the famed Screaming Eagles, was being rushed toward Bastogne in open trucks. They rode through the night, the December wind cutting through thin uniforms, their helmets rattling in the freezing air. These were paratroopers who had been resting after months of hard fighting in Holland. They had no winter gear, little heavy equipment, and almost no time to prepare, yet their mission was clear: reach Bastogne before the Germans did. The roads became a racetrack of desperation. American engineers blew bridges to slow the German advance, while armored columns from the 10th Armored Division threw themselves into holding actions, fighting with the knowledge that they could not win, only delay. Inside German columns, confidence still reigned. One officer of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division told his men, "Once Bastogne is ours, the Americans will beg for terms." But in those same hours, trucks carrying the Screaming Eagles were bouncing along frozen roads, their soldiers clutching rifles, teeth chattering, trying to sleep against the bitter cold. They were racing fate itself. By December 18th, the leading elements of both armies were closing in on Bastogne. And in a twist of history, the Americans would arrive first, barely 4 hours ahead of the Germans. That margin, 4 hours, would shape the destiny of the Ardennes. The roads into Bastogne were clogged with chaos, refugees dragging carts, stragglers from shattered American units, stumbling westward. Smoke rising from barns and villages set ablaze by retreating defenders. Through this confusion, a convoy of trucks roared forward. Headlights dimmed, canvas flapping, engines straining against the frozen air. Inside were the men of the 101st Airborne Division. The Screaming Eagles had been resting in Reims, France, when the German offensive broke. They were still licking their wounds from Holland, wounds that had cost them dearly. Many carried fresh scars, both on their bodies and in their memories. When the call came, "Bastogne needs you," they had no time to argue, no time to prepare. Within hours, they were loaded onto every truck the army could find. They rode all night, shivering in thin uniforms designed for summer drops, not the brutal Ardennes winter. The December wind knifed through the open sides of the trucks. Men huddled under wool blankets or shared body heat, teeth chattering, breath freezing on their helmets. They had no winter boots, many had no gloves. Ammunition was short, rations were scarce. Some carried little more than their rifles and grit. Yet as the trucks bounced through the dark, someone began to sing. Then another joined in. Soon the cold night echoed with the rough voices of paratroopers singing marching songs, as if daring the winter to break them. When dawn broke on December 18th, the lead trucks rolled into Bastogne. The paratroopers stumbled out stiff-legged, stamping their feet against the icy cobblestones. The town's church bells tolled faintly through the cold morning air. Civilians watched from shuttered windows, unsure whether these weary young men could truly stand against the German tide. The paratroopers themselves knew the odds. They had no tanks, no heavy artillery, and were facing a force 5 times their size. But they didn't come to retreat. They came to hold. Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment looked at his men, faces red from windburn, uniforms ragged, and muttered to a staff officer, "Hell, we may be short on everything, but we've got enough guts." The Screaming Eagles fanned out through Bastogne. They dug foxholes in frozen ground, positioned machine guns at crossroads, set up roadblocks with whatever vehicles they could find. Each squad was told the same thing: hold your ground, no matter what. As night fell, they could hear the distant rumble of German armor closing in. The men were cold, hungry, and exhausted. But they were in Bastogne, and they had arrived first. The stage was set. The crossroads town was no longer undefended, and within hours, the ring would close. By December 20th, 1944, the jaws of the German offensive snapped shut around Bastogne. One by one, every road leading in and out of the town was cut. From the north, from the south, from the east and west, German troops and tanks pushed relentlessly until Bastogne became an island of resistance in a frozen sea of enemies. Inside the perimeter, the defenders numbered roughly 22,000 men, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, elements of the 10th Armored Division, tank destroyer crews, artillerymen, engineers, clerks, cooks, and stragglers from broken units, a patchwork force thrown together by necessity. Surrounding them were nearly 5 times that number, 2 German panzer divisions and the battle-hardened Volksgrenadiers of General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. The Americans were now cut off from the outside world. Supplies dwindled quickly. Ammunition was rationed. Medical stores were already running low. Food was measured in days, not weeks. Fuel for vehicles was nearly gone. And the bitter cold bit into every man like a second enemy. Major General Maxwell Taylor, the 101st's commander, was away in Washington. Leadership fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a man who would soon become a legend in Bastogne. He gathered his officers and made the situation clear. Gentlemen, we are completely surrounded. That simplifies things. We hold Bastogne. No one gets out. No one gives up. The soldiers dug in. Foxholes were hacked into frozen soil with bayonets and helmets. Machine guns were set up on every approach road. Paratroopers crouched behind stone walls and hedgerows, their rifles cradled in frostbitten hands. The townspeople watched nervously, knowing they were trapped too. Families crowded into cellars, huddling together as shells whistled overhead. Children whispered prayers as the ground shook with each new barrage. From the German side, confidence soared. Commanders believed the Americans had only enough ammunition for 3 days, perhaps 4. Food was scarce, winter gear almost non-existent. They will surrender, one officer assured his men, or they will die. But the Americans had no such intention. Private Vince Speranza of the 501st Parachute Infantry scribbled in his notebook, "They say we are cut off. Maybe so. But cut off or not, we're here to fight. They'll have to kill us all to take Bastogne." And so, in the frozen week before Christmas, Bastogne became a fortress. A fortress without walls, a fortress of foxholes, frozen courage, and sheer defiance. The siege had begun. The siege of Bastogne was not just fought with bullets and shells. It was fought with empty stomachs, numb fingers, and the gnawing ache of exhaustion. By December 21st, the defenders were already short of almost everything. Rations were cut to the bone. Soldiers scoured abandoned barns and burned out trucks for anything edible. Some boiled snow to make thin soup. Others split a single chocolate bar 3 ways, each man letting it melt slowly on his tongue, savoring the sugar as if it were gold. Cold was the greater enemy. The 101st Airborne had been rushed from Reims with summer gear. Many wore thin jump jackets, canvas boots, and no gloves at all. In foxholes dug into frozen earth, men wrapped burlap around their boots to ward off frostbite. Some rubbed snow on their toes just to dull the pain. Medic Eugene Rowe of Easy Company wrote later, "We ran out of morphine. We ran out of bandages. Men froze in their foxholes. Some lost fingers, others their feet. I treated wounds with strips of cloth torn from shirts. That was all we had." The wounded suffered worst of all. In makeshift aid stations inside barns and basements, men lay shivering under thin blankets, praying for medicine that never came. A sergeant whispered to his buddy with a leg wound, "Hold on, supplies will come." But no one knew if that was truth or comfort. Shells fell daily, turning the town into rubble. Civilians huddled with soldiers in cellars, sharing candles and thin slices of bread. Children cried softly in the dark, muffled by mothers who feared attracting attention. Yet even in that misery, hope flickered. Rumors spread like wildfire through the foxholes. Patton's Third Army was coming. Resupply planes were ready. Relief was on the way. Corporal Frank O'Brien of the 506th scribbled in his frozen journal, "We're hungry, we're cold, But the boys are still cracking jokes. Someone passed around a cigarette tonight, and 5 of us shared it. We laughed at how pathetic it was, but that laugh kept us warm for a while. Every night, the men looked to the sky, but the weather was their enemy too. Heavy clouds, fog, and snow kept Allied aircraft grounded. Without the air, without supplies, without help, Bastogne was living on borrowed time, and yet the spirit held. As one paratrooper put it simply, we're low on everything but guts. For 6 days, the Germans had a silent ally in the Ardennes, the winter sky. From December 16th through the 22nd, the forest was smothered by a lid of heavy clouds, freezing fog, and snowstorms. For the first time since Normandy, German columns could move in broad daylight without fear of the dreaded Jabos, American fighter bombers that usually hunted anything on wheels. It was a gift the Wehrmacht had prayed for. Convoys of panzers rolled westward, their engines echoing in the valleys, free from the strafing runs that had crippled them in France. Supply trucks moved openly, headlights flickering through the mist. German officers congratulated themselves. The weather is with us. God is with us. Inside Bastogne, the weather was a curse. The men of the 101st Airborne knew salvation could only come from the sky. But with the ceiling locked in fog, there would be no resupply planes, no bombers to scatter German attacks, no parachutes drifting down with food and ammo. Instead, the sky pressed down gray and heavy, leaving only silence broken by the whistle of incoming shells. The cold deepened. By night, temperatures fell below zero. Soldiers huddled two to a foxhole, breath freezing into crystals on their collars. Rifle bolts jammed with ice. Machine guns froze solid. Medics rubbed their hands raw, trying to keep IVs flowing. The Germans waited. They believed the winter would finish the job for them. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the German 12th Panzer Corps, told his staff confidently, "The Americans are surrounded. They are cold. They are starving. 3 days, 4 at most, and Bastogne will be ours without wasting a single tank." It was not an unreasonable assumption. Every hour, the defenders grew weaker. Ammunition counts dropped. Food was nearly gone. Some men ate snow just to fill their stomachs. And yet, the Americans refused to break. Sergeant Don Malarkey of Easy Company later recalled, "We were freezing, we were hungry, but not one of us thought about surrender. Not once. We just figured we'd either hold out or die there." Still, the truth was brutal. Without supplies, without help, Bastogne could not last. The Germans believed time and weather were their greatest weapons. But on the morning of December 23rd, everything changed. The skies, so long closed, suddenly opened. December 23rd, 1944. The morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of winter day that cuts straight to the bone. For the first time in a week, the Ardennes sky was not a blanket of fog and snow. It was wide open, blue, and endless. The men of Bastogne felt it instantly. In foxholes, on the rubble-strewn streets, in makeshift hospitals, soldiers lifted their heads and looked upward. The silence was different. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, a low drone, distant, uncertain. Men leaned from their dugouts, squinting into the morning sun. The sound grew louder, rolling like thunder across the hills, and then they saw them. One plane, 10, 50, a fleet, 241 C-47 Skytrains, flying low and steady, their wings glinting silver in the winter light. The sky filled with color. Red parachutes, blue parachutes, yellow and white parachutes, hundreds of them, opening one after another until the heavens above Bastogne looked like a carnival in the middle of war. The German soldiers on the surrounding ridges froze in disbelief. They had been told the Americans were finished, starving, and without hope. Yet now, in full daylight, their enemy was being resupplied before their very eyes. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, winter clothing, even jerry cans of gasoline, all drifting gently into the encircled town. For the defenders, it was salvation. Paratroopers cheered, waving from foxholes as the bundles hit the snow. Men wept openly, laughing through frostbitten faces as they tore open crates of ammunition, candy bars, and bandages. A medic held up a box of morphine like it was gold. For the Germans, it was something else entirely. One officer spat into the snow and muttered, "This is impossible. Not even the Luftwaffe in its glory days could have done this." On that morning, the balance shifted. The Americans were no longer starving ghosts in their foxholes. They were rearmed, refueled, and reborn. The white sky over Bastogne was not just a delivery of supplies. It was a message written in steel and silk. The 101st Airborne would not fall. On the ridgelines around Bastogne, German soldiers watched the sky and felt their confidence drain away like blood from a wound. They had been told the Americans were surrounded. They had been promised the 101st Airborne was starving, freezing, desperate for surrender. Officers repeated it daily. They can't hold out. 3 days, no more. And yet, on December 23rd, they saw the opposite. Hundreds of parachutes floated into the town like a festival. Ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies, more than most German units saw in a month, dropped into Bastogne in a single afternoon. The shock rippled through the ranks. A Volksgrenadier corporal scribbled in his diary that night. "They told us the Americans were finished, but I saw with my own eyes crates of food, bandages, bullets, even chocolate falling from the sky. Our men cheered when we thought they were starving. Now we know. They will never surrender." Veterans of the Eastern Front muttered bitter comparisons. At Stalingrad, German soldiers had begged for air resupply, praying for a fraction of what they now watched the Americans receive. Luftwaffe transports had dropped only scraps, and even those were often lost to weather or enemy fire. Here in Bastogne, in the middle of winter, the Americans dropped an abundance that dwarfed anything Germany could imagine. The numbers were staggering. In one day, over 144 tons of supplies floated into Bastogne. To German eyes, it was not just relief, it was proof. Proof that America could move mountains of steel and food at will, even in the worst conditions. Some German officers tried to rally their men. "It doesn't matter," one captain barked. "They cannot eat bullets." But the words rang hollow. His men had seen the parachutes. They had seen American soldiers laughing in the snow, ripping open crates of cigarettes, lighting them as if the war were already won. It was not just a supply drop. It was a message. The Americans had more than enough. One captured German officer later admitted, "When I saw the resupply at Bastogne, I knew the war was lost. No army in history could match that." For the Germans, the siege no longer felt like a victory waiting to happen. It felt like a noose tightening around their own necks. In war, men fight with rifles and tanks. But wars are won, or lost, by something less visible: supply. At Bastogne, the contrast could not have been more brutal. On December 23rd alone, more than 144 tons of supplies floated down into the besieged town. Ammunition, fuel, food, blankets, even cigarettes. Within hours, paratroopers were loading boxes of K rations onto sleds, hauling cases of bandages to field hospitals, stacking crates of 30 caliber rounds by the dozen. A single day of American resupply provided more than some German divisions received in 6 months. The men of the Wehrmacht knew it. They saw it with their own eyes. One German officer later wrote in his memoirs, "We thought we had starved them out, but suddenly they had more than we did. Their planes delivered in one morning what we could not supply with trains in half a year." For the defenders of Bastogne, the supplies were more than material. They were morale. Soldiers who had gone 2 days on half rations suddenly tore into cans of Spam, powdered milk, and chocolate bars. Wounded men wept as morphine was injected, pain finally dulled. A medic scribbled in his notes, "It feels like a miracle." For the Germans, it was the opposite. They marched hungry. They marched cold. Their boots were worn thin. Their rations were black bread and turnips. Their fuel was measured in jerry cans stolen from villages. Entire tanks were abandoned on frozen roads because there was no gasoline to move them. And yet, across the lines, the Americans were throwing away food scraps and lighting lucky strikes. The mathematics of war had turned against Germany. America was not just feeding Bastogne, it was demonstrating a power that went beyond the battlefield. The arsenal of democracy was proving itself in silk parachutes and olive drab crates. Private Fritz Müller of the 26th Volksgrenadier summed up the feeling in his captured diary. They will never run out. We will. That is the end. In that moment, the Germans realized they were not just fighting men. They were fighting factories, railroads, and assembly lines that stretched from Detroit to California, and that was a battle they could never win. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne was still surrounded. German shells still fell. Tanks still prowled the woods. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were still cold, still hungry, still fighting in foxholes cut into frozen earth. But something fundamental had changed. The sky had opened. Supplies had arrived. And with them came a new kind of strength. Not just in rifles and rations, but in spirit. A paratrooper tore open a crate and found a can of Coca-Cola. He shared it with three buddies, each taking a sip, grinning through cracked lips as if they had stumbled onto treasure. Another soldier pulled out a Hershey bar, snapped it in half, and gave the other piece to a Belgian child hiding in a cellar. Small things, but they mattered. The men laughed again. They lit cigarettes from American supply bundles, smoke curling into the frosty air. They patched up the wounded with fresh bandages. They loaded magazines with fresh ammo, and they looked at each other with a certainty that hadn't been there the night before. We will not fall. Across the lines, the Germans felt it too. They had begun this offensive with laughter, with confidence, with dreams of splitting the Allied front. But as they watched the resupply of Bastogne, their laughter turned to silence. The truth was undeniable. The Americans had more. More planes, more trucks, more food, more everything. And behind every foxhole at Bastogne stood not just a soldier, but a factory, a shipyard, a nation that had turned its full weight to war. The message of Bastogne was written in parachutes and sealed in defiance. When the Germans sent their demand for surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gave his now famous reply: nuts. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of an empire of industry, democracy, and determination. And when Patton's Third Army broke through on December 26th, Bastogne was still in American hands, bloodied, battered, but unbroken. For the men who fought there, the memory would never fade. The hunger, the cold, the shells, and then the miracle of the sky turning white with parachutes. For the Germans who witnessed it, the message was even harsher. If America could supply a surrounded town in the dead of winter with hundreds of planes, then the war was already lost. Bastogne was not just a victory, it was a revelation that America's strength was not only in its soldiers, but in its people, its factories, its farms, and its endless ability to adapt, create, and endure. And that message carried far beyond the Ardennes, echoing through the rest of the war. The United States could not be starved, could not be broken, and would not surrender. And that was Bastogne, where courage, cold, and sheer American resolve wrote a chapter the Germans never forgot. But I'd like to hear from you. What do you think was the most remarkable moment of this siege? The defiance of the 101st, the thunder of Patton's rescue, or the miracle of those planes in the winter sky? Share your thoughts down in the comments. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. We've got many more untold tales of World War II coming, stories of ordinary men and women who faced the impossible and changed history.